There's no excuse for not knowing what Israel has done. No crime has been so documented, not least by its own victims, in real time as it actually happened. And if you are someone who used your platform to incite violence in what is a genocide, the receipts have been kept. Everything you've said and done has been archived. The reckoning will come, and I would not be as confident as you may feel that the impunity you currently feel you have is going to last forever. I don't think it will.
Welcome to The Tea with me, Myriam, François, the show where we uncover the story behind the stories. Before we get into it, can I ask you to do one thing and to support the show, and that is to hit that subscribe button now and sign up to our Patreon. Details are in the caption below. Thank you. We're living in an era of media distrust. A recent survey found that only 31% of people in the UK trust the media to do what is right, the lowest level among 28 surveyed nations. Meanwhile, alternative media voices are growing, filling the gaps left by mainstream outlets' failure to offer fair and accurate coverage of many issues, not least current events in the Middle East. Joining us to dissect all of this is none other than Owen Jones, journalist, author, and political commentator. Jones has received numerous accolades, including Stonewall Journalist of the Year and the Political Book Awards Young Writer of the Year. Today, he ranks among Britain's most influential left-wing voices. He's a Guardian columnist and the mind behind Battle Lines, a media accountability platform. Owen, welcome to the show.
Great to see you. Very snazzy, very slick, very professional.
Thank you,
Love
Owen.
this.
I mean, out here rivaling those who will no longer platform us, huh?
Well, indeed, the deplatforming spiraling out of control.
Yes, and you would know a thing or two about that. How has the last year been, Owen? How are you?
Oof, well, I'll flashback there to Holly Willoughby going, "Are you okay?" On this morning. Well, I mean, you know, it's always important to say this, but, you know, I always think whatever we go through, Palestinian journalists are being butchered along with their entire families in Gaza for speaking out about the truth in apocalyptic conditions.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's always important to say that. Obviously, you know, I mean, what I would say is it's like the world turned upside down. That's what I always say since the genocide began.
Yeah.
Which is those who have cheered on one of the great crimes of our age, who've legitimised a genocidal onslaught defined by mass murder, mostly of women and children, of apocalyptic destruction. As Donald Trump has just said, a civilization wiped out, conceding genocide. And the destruction intentionally of hospitals, of medics, aid workers, journalists, of course, rape, torture, we could go on.
Yeah.
They're the ones we're seen as mainstream and respectable. And if you oppose it, the few, because so few have used their platforms to speak out, and it's the silent who often feel angry about, we're the ones who are seen as extreme and dangerous. And, you know, and obviously if you speak out about this issue, you know what you are getting into. And that should not be an excuse, I have to say, for the silent, people who don't speak out.
Yeah. Because
if you stay, you know, the silent are always the ones who allow every atrocity in history to happen.
Absolutely.
And if they spoke out, then this wouldn't be possible. I always think it's so important, you know, during this genocidal mayhem, to just never stop being shocked, never let it be normalized, never stop thinking how messed up and deranged and just depraved all of this is, including the role of our media and our political elites who have all facilitated this. And I just, you know, but obviously if you speak out, then obviously they will go for you because they're trying to turn the world upside down. But that's not an excuse not to speak out, is it?
No.
As you do so brilliantly.
No, well, likewise, Owen, and of course it's much appreciated. I think the one of the things I was really keen to talk to you about was the ways in which, I'm sure this is true for you as it is for me, that as journalists within our profession, you know, we're raised on this idea of the media is the watchdog to power, right? And that's, I don't know, maybe naive, call me a naive journalist. I definitely went into it with this ambition of we are a counterpower to the politicians. We are devoted to investigation, research, facts, accuracy for the purpose of holding those in power accountable. To what extent do you feel like that is still the role that the media undertakes today?
Well, I mean, there are obviously brilliant, courageous journalists out there, and I would never claim otherwise. But just overall, I mean, if you look at British newspapers as an example, most of them are playthings for very wealthy oligarchs, moguls, who are very rich people who have a vested interest in the status quo as is. And they use their newspapers as political vehicles, and what they've done, I mean, Rupert Murdoch, obviously his empire is a classic example. It was the rise of Thatcherism. He was the Sun newspaper in particular, as well as the Times and all the rest. That was part of promoting a political project. And what I found always a little bit, raised my eyebrows a bit about social media, the kind of moral panic about social media disinformation, misinformation. Not that isn't a problem, by the way.
Yeah.
But, it's not like the mainstream media haven't for so long spread terrible lies and, really dangerous lies, not least about marginalized minorities. I mean, migrants, refugees, Muslims, benefit claimants, we could go on. I mean, and that attempt to redirect anger away from the powerful to those who have nothing, and to turn people who are struggling against each other, to demonize anyone who tries to speak out against the status quo. And, what the BBC has often done is firstly follow their lead. So, whatever the kind of main stories and angles that are being discussed by the BBC often reflect basically the front pages of those newspapers. Yeah. But also, on foreign policy, what the BBC and not a lot of the newspapers have just done is just follow the foreign policy lead of the British establishment. And, which is basically who are the official enemies of Britain and who are the official allies. Yes. So when it comes to the official enemies, then they will have no problem in talking about human rights violations, often to justify military intervention. But if it's our allies, then they will airbrush those, often even far worse, human rights abuses. Israel obviously is a striking example, but then you look at the horrors unleashed by the Saudi coalition in Yemen. These are horrors and injustices which aren't talked about because those are our allies, and what matters is building up a case against the official enemies. Yeah. And I just think that's the problem is the for so long the mainstream media actually has, it's not like there isn't good reporting out there, including in some of these newspapers, but overall that's the systemic problem with it. And actually the problem, there are so many problems with social media, but equally a lot of what we actually know about, for example, in terms of Gaza, is because of social media. It's because Palestinian journalists have used social media, to get across the horrors being unleashed by the Israeli state. It's this, perversely, IDF soldiers posting their war crimes on TikTok, but a lot of those wouldn't have been reported by our media outlets. So it's no surprise that actually, if you look at the US, the moral panic about TikTok was often about younger people getting access to information about what was actually happening to the Palestinian people, which they weren't getting from cable news. And a lot of older people who are far more sympathetic to Israel were just being fed basically a line which was very sympathetic to Israeli narratives, uncritical and unchallenging of it, whereas people could actually see the horrors and the atrocities being inflicted and the hatred and the genocidal rhetoric of Israeli leaders and officials, which made clear from the start what they were going to do, which most media outlets simply just ignored and didn't frame their coverage around. So I just think, there are courageous journalists out there, but it's hard. It's a systemic problem. Yes. And that's that's the issue with media. It's you always have to look at this as a systemic issue. So what is a systemic issue, Owen? Is it to do with who's financing media and who is, financing, I guess, for what intention? Yes, who runs the media? Who does run the media? Well, these are just wealthy business people. It's very straightforward. Very, very wealthy business people with a political agenda. If you're a wealthy businessman, you tend to like things like low taxes on rich people. You don't like trade unions. Rupert Murdoch went to war famously with Wapping against print workers. So they see themselves as an employer-employee relationship. That has an impact. They like ideologies which make people like them better off. It's just very straightforward. It's not even a grand conspiracy. No. And I just, so I think that's the problem. You get media outlets which, rather than being about standing up to power. They're run by the by the powerful.
Yeah.
It's expensive to run newspapers. They're often loss making. I mean, that's the thing. Media moguls will run them at a loss because they know they get other advantages, which is promoting an agenda, political agenda, which is to their benefit.
Right. Well, and it's GB News, I think, that's running at a huge loss.
Yeah.
But of course, the function of GB News perhaps isn't so much information and commercial benefit as it is the propagation of a certain outlook.
It's a political project.
It's a
political project, and what it will do is, obviously, it's the issues it selects, the angle it puts on them.
Yeah.
I mean, it is astonishing because people said before GB News, when Andrew Neil was pushing it, he's the former BBC flagship TV presenter and the former chairman of Spectator, which has always been a very hard right magazine, which has published hideous stuff, not least about Muslims and other minorities. It just shows what's possible, what is permissible and what isn't in this country.
Right.
But him and others would say, well, it won't be like Fox News. We have a different broadcasting regulation system, and it is just like Fox News, and it's just astonishing. And even occasionally, when Ofcom, the TV regulator, actually, it's largely toothless, gives them occasional slaps on the wrist. But that's the problem. Media outlets have long been allowed to just be political projects in the service of very rich media moguls.
Yeah.
And the problem with the BBC itself is, if you look at the board of the BBC, the people who, some of them are literally former Conservative activists, and again, very rich people.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be some grand conspiracy of them, in smoke-filled rooms going, wah. It's just a fact that if you get people from a certain class, from a certain elite, who are running the means of information, then it's in their interest to promote agendas which obviously are favourable to them, which they agree with, and to filter out and demonise issues, agendas, individuals who they regard as problematic and dangerous.
Yeah. And I mean, talking about the BBC, until very recently was probably one of the most trusted broadcasters in the world. I mean, if you traveled anywhere, outside of Europe, it was the reference point for many people in terms of accurate information. I think there's a very serious blow that's been dealt to the BBC's credibility as a consequence of the coverage on Gaza in particular. And you, of course, published a 9,000-word investigative article titled The BBC's Civil War Over Gaza on the Drop Site platform, which accused the BBC of exhibiting pro-Israel bias in their coverage. Now, that report has caused quite the storm, as it should. The first question I want to ask you is, what prompted you to write that report?
Very straightforward. BBC journalists got in touch with me. And what the initial spark for that was a story about a young Palestinian in his 20s with Down syndrome who had been murdered by the Israeli army. The family home had been raided by the IDF. They set their dog on him. And he was someone who, he's Down syndrome, autism, terrified about what was happening, the apocalyptic horror unleashed against Gaza, and completely confused about what was happening, not actually understanding what was happening. And they obviously had to care for him. And what happened is they were all marched out while he was left in a room having been mauled by a dog. They then came back a week later to find his decomposing body. Now, the original BBC headline was The Lonely Death of Palestine with Down syndrome. Again, and it was a classic example of, a headline which erased... because it's actually an important story,
yes.
And that's not to say there isn't examples of good stories, but when you got those stories which are important in, you can see the problem because firstly, the headline didn't ascribe responsibility. What happened to this? Was that, he got struck by lightning, did he?
Yes.
What was it? He caught a serious illness.
And this was one of your consistent findings. Anyway.
Exactly, which is look, firstly, this is a bit depressing, I'm afraid to say, but most people don't read beyond headlines.
Yes.
So that is the majority of people their engagement will come through the headline.
Yeah.
In the story itself, it didn't come on to actually what happened to him until I think about 600 words in. It didn't even explain. So, I pushed this. There was a massive uproar. And they ended up changing the headline because of the uproar. But then a BBC journalist got in touch with me to say, look, this is a systemic problem at the BBC. And what I focused on was the BBC website, not exclusive, but I mostly focused on that. It's the biggest news website on earth.
Yeah.
So it's extremely influential, more influential, I'd say, than its broadcast output. And it often influences its broadcast output because, as I discovered, a lot of the people writing the copy for that basically use the stuff which is on the website. They're often not knowledgeable, for example, about Israel or Palestine, so that's what they do. And what I uncovered firstly was constant examples of BBC journalists who felt that they were prevented from doing their job about talking about what was actually happening, a constant deference to Israeli narratives, constantly treating the IDF and their statements as credible. So even when terrible atrocities committed, it was often framed around the responses of the IDF, airbrushing out atrocities and not treating, crucially, Palestinian life as having the same value of it as Israeli life or anything close to it, being clear about what happened on 7th October being atrocities and war crimes, not being clear at all about the objective fact that these are war crimes being committed by the Israeli state. They didn't wait for a court judgment on the 7th of October in the same way as they didn't with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but that doesn't apply to Israel's onslaught. And, things like a really good example of, and this is a problem across the British media, is Israeli leaders and officials made clear their intent from the beginning. Absolutely. They said, Gallant, the defense minister, that we're fighting human animals, we will cut off all these essentials of life to them. And in fact, the Ghassan Ali, a general who's in charge of Kogat, which is the civilian arm of the Israeli army, went even further. He said Hamas has become ISIS and civilians in Gaza are celebrating instead of being disgusted. Human beasts will be dealt with accordingly. We're cutting off all food and all energy, all the essentials. You're only getting damage. You wanted hell, you'll get hell. That tweet, there was a video that was tweeted out from the Kogat account. It was addressed to Hamas and the residents of Gaza. So that was very clear. He was talking about the civilian population. He was talking about collective guilt, and he was talking about the collective punishment that they would then suffer. That's objectively a war crime. There's no two ways about it. That's an example of a quote which was almost not covered by any media organisation, mainstream media organisation, even though it was just there in the open. It wasn't covered by the BBC. And what they should have done is make clear what Israel's intent was from the start, because there's constant, the Israeli president Isaac Herzog famously saying, there are no uninvolved civilians in Gaza. It's a whole nation out there that's responsible. You could then see what happens is Israeli soldiers use that rhetoric in the same way when Netanyahu talked about Amalek in the Bible, when talking about the Amalek nation attacking the Israelites, and then the Israelites wiped the Amalek nation out. And he says, remember what Amalek did to you, and they constantly use that. And then that's constantly used by Israeli soldiers as they commit war crimes. But the problem is that intent was so clear. And, I interviewed Raz Sigal, the Israeli-American Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, who made clear, and this is early on, he said it's very rare for intent to be so openly spoken. Normally states which commit terrible crimes hush it up. You have to, they denials, they try and use humanitarian language, in top secret documents, maybe you can find out what's really going on. They just said it, but the BBC didn't report their news around it. So a lot of it is kind of not explaining what Israeli intent, the Israeli state's intent was, erasing atrocities, deferring to Israeli narratives, deferring to deceit, not challenging deceit. Yeah. So Russian official statements are not treated as credible. Yeah. When Russia says we're not targeting civilians, the BBC does not treat that as a credible statement. An IDF statement will be treated as credible. Yeah. But what I also did is, as well as going through so many examples, I worked with two brilliant data journalists, one of whom works at Bloomberg, and they just built an objective, incontrovertible, undeniable statistical case, which was looking at how Palestinian life was the coverage of Palestinian deaths was proportionately much, much lower than Israeli deaths. There was one spike which tells its own story. It's when it was the beginning of April, the World Central Kitchen bombing. Yes. You get a massive spike in the mention of Palestinian deaths, huge spike on the graph. And it's because several Western aid workers were killed, whose lives are therefore seen as valuable, but their Palestinian driver was killed too, so they had to keep going in the copy. 3 Brits, an Australian, and their Palestinian driver, and that made the mention of Palestinian death spike. But you'd get as well humanizing language, grandmother, grandfather, father, mother, of people being killed, far more proportionately used for Israeli deaths rather than Palestinian deaths, emotive descriptions of killings, massacre, for example, atrocity, again, overwhelmingly used for what happened on 7th October rather than what's happened to Palestinians.
Yeah.
So, what it shows is objective racism, and that's what they're very clear, the journalists there, this is racism. And I spoke to these 13 whistleblowers, but I know there was a letter signed, I signed it by many journalists, but it's signed by 100 BBC journalists condemning the BBC, condemning the BBC's coverage.
Yeah.
What I found striking is some of the people I interviewed didn't actually sign the letter because they didn't know about it, which just goes to show that there were so many other people at the BBC who agree with that.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. There are brilliant journalists, as I know, because I spoke to them at the BBC, but it's a structural problem. It's about editorial. It's about it goes to the very top of the BBC.
Well, let's talk about editors and the editorial steer, because as you and I both know, if you bring a story to an editor, you don't just bring them an idea, you bring them a set of facts, a set of research to back up what you think needs to be covered. So based on the interviews you've done and the people you've been speaking to, how are those conversations going? Because the bit I'm struggling with is literally how you go from Mike, because it probably is a Mike. Here is the Human Rights Watch report. Here is the Amnesty International report. I have an interview with, the UN official that represents the occupied territories. The person that we would like to do the report about has an arrest warrant out for them from the International Criminal Court. Are we okay to proceed? Where and how does the break on that story occur?
I think that's it. It's often things aren't commissioned and things, the headlines are then changed. The copy is then rejigged in ways that water down the reality and shift it onto terrain more favourable to the Israeli state. It's interesting just what you mentioned there about, for example, arrest warrants being out, because, the BBC has long used the formulation other media organisations have used, which you're going to immediately exactly know what I mean. Hamas-run health ministry, which is always used to undermine faith in the official statistics of deaths, when actually those official figures are massive underestimate of the number killed, and we know from previous conflicts that they were actually completely accurate and so on. But they won't, journalists there pointing out lack of consistency in other ways, like, for example, not making clear that Western journalists were banned from entering Gaza as a matter of course.
Yes.
Not, things like, if we're going to say, if you're going to say Iran-backed Hezbollah, then why not Western armed IDF? Why not say far-right Israeli government? Why not?
That should be the minimum, surely.
Yeah. Exactly, or Benjamin Netanyahu, who has an arrest warrant because of the International Criminal Court. It's things like that. And that's the problem. Often it's interesting because you say some of this, and I bet some people just hearing that think that's completely utopian. Like the idea of the BBC doing that seems completely ridiculous. But that just shows how the bar is on the floor, because none of this is just accuracy.
Exactly.
But it's almost like we couldn't even dream of the BBC doing that because we're so used to the way the BBC frames things being, for example, so favourable to the Israeli state. And again, the other problem is, by the way, when I say you do get good coverage, and this goes across the Western media, it's what I often call orphaned. So what happens is they'll do a really useful study about an atrocity that's happened, and then unpick Israeli false claims.
Yes.
And so even newspapers that have done terrible coverage have done this. So the Washington Post did this about the November 2023 assault on Al-Shifa Hospital, and they took apart Israeli claims. New York Times did this about £2,000 bunker bombs being dropped in safe zones in southern Gaza. CNN International did this about the Flower Massacre. But the problem is these are orphaned from wider coverage because the findings are they're not woven in to the overall stories, which is, firstly, you shouldn't take Israeli claims as credible in the way you don't with Russian claims. And, then denials about that Israel has about not targeting civilians, you can see are disproven. And you can say that, when people did this with Donald Trump, journalists in the first term, where when he lied, they would say this is a lie. Do you remember US journalists then took a decision they would do that? So they knew that wasn't compromising objectivity. If I said this studio is on fire and you said the studio isn't on fire, it's not the job of a news reporter to go, well, one denies it, says it. It's like, is the studio on fire? No.
Right.
And that's the problem, that you know, it's not deferring to objectively false claims. And that's the problem. You get good examples of journalism which show how Israel have deliberately killed civilians over and over again. They've deliberately destroyed civilian infrastructure over and over again. And then that is not woven into the wider coverage of what's happening, of what Israel is doing to Gaza.
So we had 15 months of a series of atrocities back to back in many ways. I mean, it was so relentless for this population that essentially the picture that you're suggesting could easily have been presented to the public. These atrocities were presented almost as exceptional. You know, we'll do an exceptional report on the Flower Massacre, we'll do an exceptional report on Al-Shifa. But as you say, it wasn't woven into a wider...
And it was always belated and not given proper prominence.
Yes. And so I guess we have this sense of like the default is Israel is good, but it has these occasional mishaps rather than representing the actions of the state in line with the genocidal intent that you described earlier, then backed up by a series of events that clearly bolster that intent.
It's exactly that. You know, one BBC journalist put it to me well, which is the BBC treats Israel as though it's Ukraine and Palestine as though it's Russia, which is deranged. Obviously, Palestine is an occupied, subjugated nation, which is illegally occupied by a state which is a military juggernaut, one of the most sophisticated militaries on earth, which is armed to the teeth by the world's only superpower. You know, one of which has committed infinitely worse, more deadly and hideous crimes against the other, that being the Israeli state against the Palestinian people. And the way it goes is basically, you know, again, this point I made about deferring to the foreign policy narratives of the British establishment, which is basically goes along the lines of Israel is a Western democracy and democracies may be imperfect. It's like a democracy is not... I mean, in what sense is it a democracy for the millions of Palestinians who live in Gaza and the West Bank, who are occupied against their will and have no say over that? You know, that alone, you know, an ethno-state is not a democracy. It's incompatible with a democracy. Whatever I think about Western democracies like Britain and how flawed they are, you know, that is clearly a different kettle of fish.
I mean, Amnesty International has termed Israel an apartheid state. This is not just a slogan of the radical left. It's the analysis of the leading human rights group in the world. That this is an apartheid state, and yet that's a term we never hear reported in legacy media.
No, and just, I mean, to prove that, you know, which is why it should just be taken as an objective fact, in the West Bank, Palestinians are subjected to the military court system. Israel is the only country on earth which routinely tries Palestinian children. Sorry, the only state in the world that tries routinely children in its military court system. These are military courts where the judge is an Israeli soldier, where it's conducted in Hebrew, and where the conviction rate is 99%. And then that's not even talking about those in administrative preventative detention who aren't tried at all or charged at all, and often they can be locked up for months or years without even knowing why they're locked up, and that includes children. But the point is, if you're an Israeli settler, then you're subject to the civil system. Clearly, that's just apartheid. I mean, that alone, that's just one example. So, you know, but that's not communicated to a Western audience.
So why is this not communicated? Because I understand your point about, obviously, the establishment media, and that's what the BBC is. You know, we know this on other issues where the BBC's official line aligned far too closely with deeply problematic foreign policy decisions. I'm thinking of the Iraq War in particular. But surely, you know, there is a difference between there being a sort of official, you know, sympathy for an ally and misleading the public about...
But that's what it is, though. It's just, I mean, Israel is seen as a Western ally. And I'm afraid it really comes down to that. And, you know, which is why, I mean, you can see how in the run-up to, for example, the Iraq War, what happens in that situation is, I mean, again, there were good journalists who challenged that.
There were.
But many media organisations simply became, you know, means of building up...
cheerleaders of war.
Well, consent and acquiescence for what happened. And then they would build up a case, including with false claims. And, you know, that Iraq is a really good example because Iraq used to be, under Saddam Hussein, an ally of the West. So what was interesting then is when you got the 2003 invasion of Iraq, what was often conjured up to legitimise that invasion was the gassing of the Kurds in 1988.
Yeah.
But the West didn't kick off in 1988 about the gassing of the Kurds. They were arming Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the time. The people who were speaking up, one little-known backbench MP called Jeremy Corbyn challenged the then Conservative government about Saddam Hussein's gassing of the Kurds and was basically just slapped down and ridiculed. So the point I'm making is, these human rights, terrible, egregious human rights abuses by regimes which the West is allied to, don't matter. They do suddenly matter when, in the case of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, they do something which goes against the strategic interests of the West. It's really very straightforward and very, very cynical. And that is a recurring problem, which is that the Western media is not promoted. It doesn't have a consistent position on foreign policy, which is about what the truth is and who is committing terrible crimes against who. It's deeply informed by
manufacturing consent.
Well, it is manufacturing consent based on which countries that we're allied to. And a lot of this is journalists on the foreign policy establishment. They defer to the positions of the foreign policy establishment and the security services. Just on that quickly, the BBC, MI5 used to vet all their staff until the 80s. It's ridiculous.
I'm pretty sure they still vet some.
Well, I would imagine they do. We don't know exactly what the selection base is, but they did for decades. So it's not a conspiracy theory. I'm not putting, it's not this is not tinfoil hat stuff.
No, you can search this stuff. Luckily, there are some journalists who've also done some research on it. The Tea is a fully independent, non-partisan production. No corporate ties here, just a small, dedicated team working hard to bring you honest, impactful conversations. If you believe in our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button now and join us on Patreon. You'll find the link in our bio. I want to ask you about some of the atrocities that have gone on that have sort of not really made the headlines in a way that, even with the cynicism that we're expressing here, I might have expected. So I'm thinking of things like the Sidi Timan abuse, the sexual assault of Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons. And of course, we know that many of those people are not actually convicted of anything. No. They're just arrested.
Thousands.
Thousands of people arrested en masse, taken in, tortured, and in some cases, tortured to death. That would seem to me like a pretty significant scandal. How do you explain the fact that hasn't really registered? I mean, today, for example, if you go on to a discussion around what's happening in Gaza and Israel's role in the assault, and you raise these issues, it doesn't become a point of discussion.
No.
You don't get engaged on it.
No.
Someone doesn't go, yes, actually, that's a very good point, Mr. Israeli ambassador. What do you say to the report that emerged showing that, no, it sort of gets dismissed?
This really underlines the mass dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And it's a really good example you've come up with there, because many of those who are Palestinian detainees are hostages, and they should be called hostages. The taking of civilians as hostages is a grave war crime. And that's true about those Israeli civilians who were taken on the 7th of October. No question about that. They should always have been released. Let alone any ill treatment which may have also taken place while they were in captivity. When I interviewed the very courageous Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, and this was actually towards the beginning of the genocide, the point he made to me, and this sets off various people who don't like the truth, is that, generally speaking, the treatment of those Palestinian detainees is worse than the treatment of those Israeli hostages. And then people come back on that with, how dare you, these are people who are suspected of terrorism, and you're comparing it to people, snatched from their homes. Well, I'm sorry, a lot of these Palestinian detainees are snatched from their homes.
They literally are.
From their family homes and their children. And before 7th of October happened, a few months before, Save the Children released a report, a very respectable international NGO, about the plight of Palestinian child detainees, children. We're talking about children here. And hundreds of children are detained by the Israeli occupation. Now, some of them are put through a kangaroo court system, as I mentioned, which is not in any sense, a military court system where it's in Hebrew and the judge is an Israeli soldier and there's a 99% conviction rate. And the trial is over in minutes, by the way.
And they can use secret evidence against you. Yeah.
So that's a sham anyway.
Yeah.
But others they're just snatched in the dead of night, and they're taken into captivity with no explanation whatsoever given to them to their families, who are often not even sure where their kids are.
Yeah.
And what Save the Children established is those children not only have suffered physical abuse, but sexual abuse. Now, the plight of Palestinian detainees, including Palestinian hostages, was already hideous before 7th October. But what we've seen since then is just unbelievable barbarism. And you mentioned Steve Timon, where we know, and the Israeli Human Rights Organization have detailed what these people have been subjected to: starvation, obviously, denial of medical treatment for those with serious illnesses, hideous, depraved violence and torture, including rape, sexual abuse and rape. And I'm sorry this is a hideous example, but one of Gaza's most respected doctors was amongst those who was taken there, and the report suggests that he was raped to death. What happened is 3 Israeli soldiers took it in turns to rape him with their guns, which was done in front of people. And there are, it is believed he was raped to death in that way. And, dozens of Palestinian detainees have died in custody. We don't know the exact circumstances. The Israeli authorities refused to allow the Red Cross any access, the Red Crescent or Red Cross to allow any access to those detainees. But they are, often, for example, shackled down to the ground in nappies, and terrorized, attacked by dogs, including reports suggest sexually attacked by dogs. One example which came to light was the gang raping of a Palestinian detainee on camera. What happened then is, because the Israeli authorities are afraid of the International Criminal Court extending their arrest warrants to cover torture, for example, which hasn't happened, which is obviously absurd, to be honest. And the ICC, what they do is they intervene on the basis of what's known as complementarity, which is we will only intervene if we are satisfied that the justice system of this country will not deal with it itself. So performatively, they then sought to arrest, in this case, some of the Israeli soldiers who had literally gang raped someone on camera. That then triggered pro-rape riots in Tel Aviv, attended by Israeli politicians, and these soldiers, when released, nothing's going to happen to them. So that's just an example of, we're talking at the moment, there are something like 250 Palestinian children who are languishing in these conditions, more than the total number of Israeli hostages taken on 7th of October. Their lives clearly do not matter to the Western media. We saw the way the media responded to the recent release of 3 Israeli hostages and how they had clearly lost weight, and any, again, of that ill treatment is a war crime. Being taken was a war crime in the first place. And always been morally consistent, always should be morally consistent about this. Repeatedly, Palestinian detainees have been released, clearly starved, and clearly having been tortured.
Well, so, and it does warrant to be said here that in the case of the Palestinian detainees in Israeli detention, we know them to be on rations. This is something that you can, the Israelis themselves have discussed. They actually calculate, even for the residents of Gaza, the amount of food that they will get, which is a form of starvation. In the case of the Israeli hostages, completely agree that any person who is a civilian should not obviously be taken, and that's a war crime. The question is, were they being deliberately starved, or were they maybe being kept in the north of Gaza, where the entire population was being subjected to starvation, including any of the hostages that would have been in that location? Because I know someone who's just got back from the north and there was no food. Everybody was starving.
Which they said, this is the point, Dimi Reader, an Israeli journalist, made that point. He said the taking civilians hostage is always a war crime. And then he said, but to my dear fellow Israelis, what should you expect when our country deliberately starved Gaza? And again, they said what they were going to do from the start. Yoav Gallant, the defence minister, said there was going to be a total siege on human animals, as I noted did the head of Kogat, who's in charge of the occupied territories. But equally, last April, as ProPublica, US investigative journal media outlet, found, last April, the US State Department's refugee agency plus USAID both said that Israel was deliberately starving Gaza. Look, it's ridiculous that I have to appeal to authority here of the US, to US government departments, because it's just objectively true what was happening.
Yes.
Multiple US aid agencies, as well as all the NGOs said it's being starved.
Everyone's saying it.
The British Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron wrote a letter,
Yes.
which was addressed to Alicia Kearns, also a Conservative MP, last March. She was then chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, detailing the ways that the Israeli state was deliberately preventing aid from getting into Gaza and to the people of Gaza. And there's multiple other ways as well, pernicious ways, like constantly bombing police who are guarding, bombing aid workers and food deliveries, destroying all the roads. So, there's multiple ways.
Yes.
But in any case, it's obviously true that in lots of cases, the Israeli hostages should never have been taken as a war crime, were clearly, in some cases, better fed than many Palestinians. But in this particular case, I don't know that, and again, hostages should always be released full stop, including if they clearly can't be looked after. The fact is, Gaza was starved deliberately. 83% of all plant life destroyed in Gaza. Its food production, its agriculture destroyed, unable to produce food. And that clearly means some of those Israeli hostages were being starved like anybody else, as well as the fact they were being bombed to death like everybody else, because it was being carpet bombed. And in some cases, as the Israeli-Palestinian media outlet Plus 972 has revealed, basically Israeli chemical weapons being used to asphyxiate and kill some of those hostages. Not deliberately, but that's the byproduct of waging an all-out assault on a tiny strip of land no bigger than East London. So these are just realities. And it just shows again, it's the racist dehumanization and the failure to spell out what Israel has actually done to Gaza and to its people. And the fact we had, for months, aid agencies spelling out hunger and famine in Gaza, Palestinian children starving to death. There is, let's just be frank, infinitely more anger about the Israeli hostages released looking gaunt than about children starving to death, including hunger subjected an entire people. It is racism. It's not, that's the thing, from the very beginning, there hasn't even been a pretense. The Western media has not made this subtle. They have made it abundantly clear. They believe that Palestinian life is worth the tiniest slither of an Israeli life or Western life. And the straightforward answer to that is Israelis are seen as us, Westerners, and Palestinians are seen as them. And it's the most shameless, flagrant, unashamed racism imaginable.
Okay, so I follow you to that point. However, I also know that if it was any other part of the world and you brought the story that we just discussed about child detainees, about sexual assault in detention, for any other country, your editor would jump on it, particularly if you had evidence to back that up from multiple sources, including reputable human rights groups and charities, which is what we do have in this particular case.
Overwhelming evidence.
Overwhelming
evidence. It could not
evidence.
be more documented.
And on the other hand, we have events that we don't know exactly what happened. And I want to ask you about the repeated allegation of the 40 beheaded babies, okay, which we have seen continuously sprawled over the Western media, and as well as the allegations of systematic rape by Hamas. Now, I'm aware that the Israeli public prosecutor has not brought a case against Hamas for rape.
Well, they also, more to the point, because there's an easy way to settle this, isn't there? Which is the UN offered to have an inquiry into all claims of sexual violence, which should always be taken seriously, all allegations of sexual violence committed by anybody since all of this began. And Israel has refused to cooperate with that. And that would be, I think, a pretty useful step forward to establish exactly what is true and what isn't true, and to get justice for anybody who has suffered sexual violence. But they have literally shut that inquiry cannot take place.
But so here's the question. I follow you that racism is why Palestinian lives are not given the same amount of credibility in terms of, affording them time and attention than basically white people, which is what Israelis are not only perceived as, but
well, the way it's racialized. Because there's obviously Mizrahati, Arab Jews and Israelis, but obviously the dominant
perception
and the dominant people. It just shows how racialization takes place. Because actually, many Israelis and Palestinians don't look different. That's not how. But how people are racialized You know, Irish people were once excluded from the concept of whiteness. All of these are these are you know are conjured up and created, but it is obviously anti-Palestinian racism.
But is it just that though? Because these we've just discussed evidence of acute forms of human rights abuses that are extremely well documented, ignored, Palestinians. And then we have allegations that are unsubstantiated and in many places debunked by various authorities that continue to do the rounds. Why is that happening, Owen?
Very straightforward, I think. It was interesting. Al Jazeera did a really good report and documentary. Brilliant journalist Richard Sanders, who worked on it, about what actually happened on 7th October. And it was a very rigorous journalistic attempt to separate fact from fiction. And the point it made was Hamas committed war crimes that day, and Israel and its allies, as the documentary said, focused on the crimes that didn't happen rather than the ones that did. And you have to ask yourself why. And the 40 beheaded babies is a really good example of that. That disgusting lie was spread by multiple media organisations, journalists. I would note, by the way, we're talking about the BBC, the former head of BBC Live programming. He used to be the producer in charge of things like Daily Politics and now Politics Live, as well as it used to be This Week. He was one of those who tweeted this out, never deleted it, which was about these reports of 40 babies, many of them beheaded. And the President of the United States also used his bully pulpit to spread that infamous, notorious lie. We know one Israeli baby was killed on the 7th of October, 8-month-old Mila Cohen, who was shot through the door of a safe room. Again, not an inexcusable crime.
None.
There was another unborn baby who was killed after their mother was shot. You know, why was this lie about the beheading of babies spread? Now, I'd put to you, there was nothing almost you could possibly think of that is more depraved than someone beheading a baby. And the point was to portray the violence committed on the 7th of October as uniquely barbaric in order to build consent and acquiescence for what Israel was going to do to Gaza, because they were obviously always going to kill far more people, but the argument would be their violence is uniquely depraved. They're monsters. And when people felt sympathy for the Palestinian people and children and babies being slaughtered, then pro-Israel cheerleaders go, no, think back to those beheaded babies.
Yeah.
This is where monsters live. These people aren't human. You know, dull your feelings of empathy and of grief and revulsion because of what they did.
This is classic colonial Hamburg.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You portray, exactly. And it goes back because, you know, there have been, throughout history, forms of anti-colonial violence which, you know, in which atrocities have been committed. No question about that. But often you get falsehoods being spread in order to dehumanize and then justify infinitely great atrocities. Now, the truth is, at the beginning of this year, we know nearly 1,100 Palestinian babies were, according to the official statistics, have been killed. Some of these, by the way, were not only burned alive, because that was also a false claim which was spread, but they were actually beheaded by Israeli weapons.
Right.
But, I mean, these were little babies who were burned alive, suffocated under rubble, blown up by mortars. Some
left to die in premature units of hospitals, left to rot for us to find their decomposing bodies.
The point you make, that Giora Island, who was an Israeli general and advisor to the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, he used to be the head of the National Security Council, who pushed loudly for electricity to be cut off there. And he said the consequence of this will be Palestinians will be complaining about their babies being dying, you know, and then we have to just, you know, ignore all that. And that was weeks before then all those Palestinian babies did indeed die because the electricity being got off to their hospitals. You know, the fact is, you know, and by the way, hundreds of those babies, something like 300 of those babies, are babies born after 7th October. All they ever knew was horrible mayhem, and they died. Some of them died immediately, some of them did not die immediately. Some of them died hideous deaths, and we're talking about babies.
Yeah.
I find it's so disgusting how you got more anger and grief over fictional beheadings of Israeli babies, which never happened, than you do over the mass slaughter of Palestinian babies. But they are connected, because the point was to present the justification for this genocidal rampage was on the basis of this violence is uniquely depraved and subhuman, therefore you should allow us to do anything we want because nothing is as bad as that.
So we know the barbarians at the gates is the classic, handbook explanation used by the colonizers to justify their acute violence against the colonized resistance. But I can understand that coming from the Israeli, embassy, from the Israeli military. What I don't understand is that same spin coming from our colleagues. Why is this still being put out by people who are otherwise fronting respectable shows? I know Rachel Riley on the BBC and others who are quite happy to continue to spread misinformation of that nature. Can I just say, can we be completely honest on here, Owen, that if you were a BBC journalist and you tweeted anything sympathetic in any way, shape or form to Palestinians, you would be brought in by your editor for a discussion over impartiality and the fact that you signed a contract that said that you shouldn't be taking political positions on your social media.
100%. And that point, actually, I mean, let's go further than that. Those who spread without correction or retraction the beheading of Israeli babies, there is no consequences for them. And actually what then comes back sometimes is, well, does it even matter? Like, people were killed that day, right? Why are you being so pedantic about it? Doesn't it matter that terrible things happened that day? It's like, okay, fine, let's go down that path, shall we? I'll just start claiming that Israeli soldiers are beheading Palestinian babies, even though Palestinian babies actually are being slaughtered en masse and some have been beheaded by weapons used by the Israeli army. If I did that, I would lose my job.
You would?
I would be sacked. It would cause a massive, I would be denounced as a disgrace to journalism. If I said Israeli soldiers, based on a false report, were beheading Palestinian babies and I did not retract it, I would suffer severe consequences, even though there has been a mass slaughter of actual babies. In the case of 7th October, where one baby was killed, again, a terrible crime. If that one baby is a terrible crime, which it is, what words do we have for the mass slaughter of Israel?
So why do these people still have their jobs, Owen?
Because again, it goes to show, again, part of this is obviously the racism which comes from partly, well, it's colonialism, isn't it? I mean, it's Israel is a colonial project. It's presented as basically this outpost of Western civilization with the barbarians at the gates, as you mentioned. And that is a mentality which is ingrained in Western culture, because the West went around the world, invaded entire lands, enslaved their people, stole their resources, and they had to justify and rationalize that, which is these people are lesser than us. And, therefore we can commit these terrible atrocities against them. And then when there's inevitable resistance against that and backlash against that, then we go, well, what, they're monsters. See, that proves they're monsters. And that mentality is ingrained in Western culture. And people just, the British Empire is a very recent endeavor.
Yeah. But okay, I take your point that there is, racism endemic in this society and that we have never dealt with the legacy of imperialism and colonialism in the UK or Europe more generally. But is there not something a bit more nefarious going on here? Because we also have individuals who are editors in certain positions at, major broadcasting outlets who have ties to the Israeli government, who are either receiving funding from it or who have, in some cases, worked for, outlets that are, even more of a cheerleader of the genocide than the Israelis themselves. I'm thinking of, for example, the Jewish Chronicle.
So Robbie Gibb was the chair of a commission which brought up the Jewish Chronicle. Very murky, I have to say, in terms of what that actually meant in practical terms. But under, that, the Jewish Chronicle, I mean, the Jewish community deserve a good media outlet, and the Jewish Chronicle is not that. It's a rag which has repeatedly published racism, and which is also,
inaccuracies, right? I mean, the point was even the IOF, the Israeli forces, actually had to request they retract statements that were inaccurate. I mean, that's how far.
Exactly. Robbie Gibb, until recently, I can't remember when he stopped being the head of that consortium, but he was there for several years. And the Jewish Chronicle cannot be regarded simply as a communal newspaper. Because it promotes very clearly a aggressively uncritical pro-Israel line, and has also printed, it's just printed just awful racist bile, and the relationship Robbie Gibb actually had with that news outlet is not even transparent or clear, because, there was a claim, he doesn't take, not involved in day-to-day editorial processes, but then a former Jewish Chronicle journalist said that isn't true. He was in the office and involved in various different ways.
Impartiality.
But then at the BBC, that's the point, because he sits on a board, I think it's a 4-person or 3-person board, which deals with complaints to the BBC about issues to do with impartiality and governs the question of impartiality. I mean, that is an absurd reality. I mean, another example that I would point out is The Atlantic. The editor of The Atlantic is a former IDF prison guard. Imagine, a former Palestinian militant was in charge of various, you can't even imagine this, can you? It's just absurd.
Well, I think the point is it would be flagged as, within the institution as posing a problem with regards to the editorial line and impartiality of the outlet itself.
Well, of course. I mean, the fact is, if somebody has served in the armed forces of a state, which is engaged,
government,
I mean, it's just which is engaged in a very long-running, should we say, let's call it controversy or something, as a euphemism. That's clearly an issue, and and I think the New York Times has that issue as well, in terms of and again, the problem you get there is. I mean, that's not, again, that doesn't even need to be a conspiracy. It's just the fact is that shows that it's a systemic problem because of who is hired and who isn't hired. Yeah. Because we know for a fact, though, many of these same media outlets do not hire Palestinian journalists or even Arab journalists on those beats and regard people with pro-Palestinian sympathies as problematic and can be deemed as a threat to impartiality. Well, so I mean, this is the issue. It's a systemic problem.
But it goes even further than that, because it's not just they won't hire them. We've also seen a purge of journalists over the last 16 months who were prepared to hold Israeli officials accountable 100%. Either on camera or in print. And I'm thinking from, Beldanati at Sky, Mehdi Hassan at MSNBC. I'm thinking of Sangeeta Miska at LBC. Yep. I'm thinking of Antoinette Latouf at ABC. Yep. There are innumerable cases now of journalists who were literally doing their job. In other words, they had before them an official who was representing a government that is accused of perpetrating a genocide and war crimes. They asked them tough questions, which we would expect a good journalist to do, and they were subsequently fired.
100%. There's a huge McCarthyite tide across the Western world. It was always there when it comes to questions of Palestine. It's intensified. Have you noticed, by the way, no one talks about cancel culture anymore? Do you remember this free speech?
Cancel culture is
it's not talking about free speech.
Not a thing.
Because the people who were talking about cancel culture and free speech, often to justify people being racist and not being criticised for it, those same people are now the same people who have been pushing heavily for the deplatforming and silencing of people who aren't, by the way, it doesn't even necessarily just mean people who are actually opposed to what the Israeli state has done to the Palestinians. Often just people just doing their job and doing it as journalists.
They were literally doing it. Antoinette, the only thing Antoinette did was repost on her Twitter a Human Rights Watch report.
Which is absurd because it's, it's the most, it's like this mainstream international human rights organization publishing heavily evidenced reports based on objective facts. Yeah, the fact is, there has been, throughout the Western media, a deliberate attempt to silence, purge, intimidate, harass people from speaking out. And I'm afraid to say it's worked with some people. And I have to say, I get angry about them because I just, I think if people are prioritising their career at the moment over what's happening. Look, speaking of myself, I'm blacklisted from various TV channels, essentially. I used to, people might know, they would have seen me on lots of various shows, which I don't now appear on. And, and again, and you don't speak out on this issue because you think it's going to be good for your TV career. You do it because you think it's the right thing to do. And I'm not saying this to get a small violin out. I'm saying,
no,
I'm just explaining that people need to know what actually happens and what the consequences are. And they will basically, try and flag you basically as kind of like, controversial, and because you've challenged one of the worst crimes of our age. That doesn't happen to someone who has legitimized some of the worst possible atrocities that humans are capable of.
Speaking of silencing, there are some rumours that you have been silenced internally at The Guardian for your articles, which are fantastic and accurate, and I'm not sure what the issue would be, but I'd be very interested to hear how that's going.
Inevitably, there have been some difficult moments. That's definitely true. And, you know, anyone who speaks out on this issue at any newspaper faces problems and consequences. There's no question about that. And you have to fight very hard to be able to do your job. And I think what I would say to all my colleagues in the Western media, whoever they happen to be, is history is a savage judge. And what people do now and they say now will be remembered in the future. It's very important that we account properly who did what at what time. And at the moment, because Israel has impunity and therefore people who cheerlead for Israel have impunity, I think there's a general sense that the very few people with a platform, because I mean, in the Western media, if you're a newspaper columnist, who have you got? Me and Nesri Malik, who's brilliant, my colleague at The Guardian.
Yeah.
We're a very small, isolated group of people. I mean, literally, in terms of who stuck to the subject, it's me and Nesri Malik in the Western media. Which,
and not just the Western media, because it's...
Sorry, in the British, I meant the British media.
But more than that, on the left. Because this is possibly even more shocking.
Yeah, I mean, people exactly
within the left wing.
But what I'd say is,
media.
You know, what happens is if you speak out on this issue, you get targeted by people who, well, you just, you know, the pro-Israel lobby just, you know, puts in as many complaints as they can. That's what they do. They overwhelm people with complaints in an effort to cause people problems.
But editors know this is a thing.
Well, you would hope so, wouldn't you? If there was any hope for humanity, then this will be remembered as one of the great crimes of our age. And those who spoke out, obviously will be remembered for making the right call. And I think any attempts to actually silence people and prevent them from doing their job or to censor people, I don't think it's going to be remembered very kindly. And I think it's crucial that people don't allow themselves to be silenced and don't put their career first. You know, it's not about our careers. It's about, you know, it's about making sure that during an abominable crime, that you spoke out and you did everything you could to tell the truth. I mean, that's the problem. You know, all I've ever done is tell. You know, if I ever get things wrong, I correct them. You know, and I would just say on that, by the way, just to show just how the media works. You know, Dan Hodges, who works at the Mail on Sunday.
Yes.
And he, you know, tweeted out saying that that all, you know, in response to the Israeli hostages just being released, that Britain should not spend a penny on the reconstruction of Gaza until every Hamas terrorist is killed or put in prison. And then someone said, well, so then hundreds of thousands of civilians, including children, can just go to hell. And he responded, yes, basically. They stuck to his guns. People said that's collective punishment. He didn't dispute that. And he said, you know, when someone who was actually on his side said, well, I feel sorry for ordinary Palestinians because, you know, they may be made to suffer because of Hamas in Iran. And he said, I've got to admit my sympathy for ordinary Palestinians is pretty low this morning. And he put ordinary Palestinians in quotes as if to dispute
the notion they even exist.
Well, exactly. And the point there is there's no consequences for him.
Right.
Imagine someone said that about Israeli civilians. Imagine someone responded to a tweet about Israeli children with
Let's be honest, you'd be arrested for
you
that
would.
tweet is actually what would happen.
Public Order Act 986. You know, I always have to be slightly careful because I got attacked by a neo-Nazi and his accomplices in 2019. That was on my birthday. He got sent to prison, which I opposed because I'm not a believer in castle solutions for political problems. But as in, you know, he had a house full of Nazi material. But as in, because of that, and I kept getting targeted by the far right, I have to take, obviously, threats of violence and death carefully. Not just because it's easy to be a martyr, but, you know, in that attack, my friends got assaulted trying to protect me, kind of thing. But obviously, yeah, I mean, you know, you get an avalanche of, as everyone does who speaks out on this. And in your case, you get, you know, that takes a very misogynistic flavour. I get obviously a lot of homophobic stuff, but as in you get, you know, lots of threats of violence and death from the pro-Israeli side. And I would know, you know, the far right and that pro-Israeli side have often just completely merged. And they, you know, the kind of violent, you know, you see this with the likes of Tommy Robinson, who's, you know, this thuggish convicted fraudster, who's currently in prison, who is a staunch supporter of Israel because they see it as a Western outpost, and portray it as a kind of a defense against the Muslims.
Right. They play a very useful role there. Last question I want to ask you is about this accountability. Craig Mokabo, who's a former UN official, has written about the fact that at the Nuremberg trials, there were media outlets like Der Stürmer, whose editor was put on trial for providing the ideological lubricants to the Holocaust. The same happened in Rwanda with, the presenters of particular radio stations. Do you think that there will be a day of reckoning for those who have lent their voice, their credibility, their position to the ideological support for this genocide?
The Genocide Convention of 1948, Article 2, criminalises 5 acts. One of them obviously just being the actual act of committing genocide, but one of the others is complicity in genocide, and the other is the public and direct incitement of genocide. That has been translated into the statute books of various countries. I would know Israel, where the public incitement of genocide still carries the death penalty in theory, which obviously has not been applied to those who have incited genocide in its media and political establishments. But I would say this, it's obviously the case that we need those who have armed Israel to go to prison, and it's really important we fight for that. Those who are directly complicit. But I would say to certain journalists who have used their platforms feeling protected by the impunity that they think the umbrella protection of Israel therefore shields, that impunity feels contagious. Israel has impunity, therefore anyone who defends Israel has impunity. Things can change quite quickly, actually. This has been a profoundly educational experience for lots of people in the worst possible way. And if you look at public opinion, despite the media bias, which is ludicrous, 70% or so of the British public think Israel have committed war crimes, so they can obviously see reality there. A large majority want an arms embargo. The majority want Benjamin Netanyahu to be arrested if he appears on British soil. The point I'm making is, already in the here and now, actually, we have public opinion on our side. I think, the point I'd make is, accountability might seem unrealistic now. But who knows what things will be like in 5 years, 10 years? I would ask people, are you completely confident? If you look back at all the things you've said during this, and if you look at the fact there is no excuse for not knowing what happened, there's no excuse for not knowing what Israel has done, no crime has been so confessed to so repeatedly, so shamelessly by its perpetrators in history, from the very top, its leaders, political and military, to soldiers on the ground. No crime has been so documented, not least by its own victims, in real time as it actually happened. There was no excuses and nowhere to hide. And if you are someone who used your platform to incite violence in what is a genocide, and to promote notions of collective guilt and therefore collective punishment, and to try and normalise and legitimise what happened, then all I would say is, I wouldn't be completely confident if I were you, that one day you are not going to have to answer, not just in terms of, because we need to ruin careers. I'm not saying it's for vengeance, it's not about that. It's about the fact that if we normalise what has just happened, if we normalise people's complicity, then it's not just about the Palestinian people. In the here and now, of course, that's crucial. It's about the future of humanity, because we are heading already to a very dark place.
Indeed.
If we normalise this depravity and this barbarism, then we are going to end up on the road to hell. And we have to do everything we can till the day we die to hold these people to account in the world of politics, but also the media for what they've done. At the very least, destroy their careers and turn them into public pariahs. But I think, in the same way, as you know, journalists in Germany and in Rwanda had to face legal accountability for what they did. I think we'll see what happens in the coming years, because we're documenting everything.
Yeah.
There's something called the Accountability Archive. The receipts have been kept. Everything you've said and done has been archived, and
the reckoning is coming.
The reckoning will come. And I would not be as confident as you may feel that the impunity you currently feel you have is going to last forever. I don't think it will.
Owen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you for joining us today. In a world where trust in journalism is at an all-time low and corporate and political interests shape the narratives we consume, independent voices matter more than ever. At The Tea, we hope to challenge misinformation and open up alternative discussions. If you found this conversation valuable, don't forget to subscribe and support us on Patreon. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking the truth, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Tea.